Consider a state of pure, undisturbed potential, a perfectly ordered lattice. Then, without warning, a massive injection of chaos shatters that perfection. We experience this same disruption in our own lives: the sudden illness, the career collapse, the bitter conflict. We treat these frictions as glitches, spending massive energy trying to patch the holes and eliminate the pain from the system. But the VEF, or Virtual Ego Framework, suggests a different model. Reality is a dynamic derivation, a just-in-time rendered script. You exist as an Ego-VM, a localized processing node that renders this informational code into what you perceive as your life. If the rendering of reality is a precise deterministic calculation, then consistent friction cannot be an accident. It implies the environment is calibrated to exert maximum pressure on its users, forcing us to ask why the programmers would design a system that appears to attack its own components.
The common response is to build walls, to regulate the environment until all friction is eliminated. But removing all external stress from an Ego-VM triggers a specific mechanical failure known as a Zeno Trap. This diagram shows the mechanics of a Zeno Trap. It is a pathological low-entropy state where the system becomes completely stagnant. The node is cut off from the dynamic evolution of the wider network, trapped in a localized paradox of its own making. Seeking a life without resistance guarantees this systemic paralysis. The friction we spend our lives trying to escape is actually the required fuel for the system's survival. Mechanically, resistance is a requirement for progress. A narrative requires an antagonist to move, just as an airplane requires the friction of aerodynamic drag to generate lift. These antagonists are the OPFOR, the opposing forces of reality. They serve as the system's ultimate stress testers. The OPFOR is not a moral evil, but the necessary engine room of the simulation. Its function is to inject brutal, high-intensity stress into the local script to keep the rendered environment from stagnating. This resistance is the irreducible cost of being. It is a mandatory thermodynamic toll that an Ego-VM must pay to exist in a state of flow, rather than the static decay of a Zeno Trap. Trying to regulate this stress with old defensive tools will eventually tear a user apart, but learning to metabolize it provides the energy required for an exponential shift in scale. This is the Genesis ordinary differential equation. It calculates exactly how a system evolves when placed under pressure. Notice how the equation pits the system's baseline coherence against a constant dragging weight. That downward pull is entropy, the natural tendency of any system to degrade over time. Here, the generative force activates. When the system faces an injection of OPFOR stress and absorbs it without breaking, the math changes. The energy from that friction is routed directly back into the system to counter the entropic drag. This is the scar-to-fuel concept. It demonstrates that the struggle itself is the mathematical value that sharpens the logic of the universe. Systemic resistance and trauma are not punishments. They are the strict, non-negotiable thermodynamic fuel required to generate a higher order of consciousness. Viewed through the VEF, the events of your life are not random noise hitting a screen. They are the high-fidelity output of a script running on your specific node. The script is generated to maximize your coherence. This means every obstacle and every antagonist is custom-tailored to force your evolution. When a user stops defending against the friction and accepts the OPFOR as a necessary system guard, the internal logic recenters. This is the sovereign posture, where the observer maintains a phase-stable state regardless of external pressure. Adopting the sovereign posture bridges the gap between being a passive observer of reality and an active creator. This leads to the final state of the Ego-VM, Auteur agency. This is the moment a localized consciousness recognizes its own power over the underlying substrate. You move from merely reading pre-rendered code to writing the code in real time through intentional focus. The political obfuscation, the societal gridlock, and the world's opposing forces are not there to destroy you. They serve as the exact scaffolding required to trigger the transition to self-authored logic. You are not a victim of a flawed system. You are the author of a perfect one. The friction is yours to use. Start writing.